coming to our panel today. We are talking about policy options to strengthen and expand women's economic inclusion. And that is a far-reaching topic that really has many ways in which you can speak about it. You can speak about it from an economist. You can speak about what economic policy has to say to women and their status as rural women, their status as people who are in the informal sector, you know, and also in terms of technology and thinking about the digital divide and how policy can really speak to that. So today we're joined by the Special Advisor for African Innovation, Chenai, who will be speaking to us, and she is from Mozilla Foundation. And then we also have Sonia Phalatse, who's a researcher who's joining us from Johannesburg at the Institute for Economic Justice. And we also have Tolulope Babajide, and she is coming in from Sahel Consulting, Agriculture and Nutrition Limited. She's a financial inclusion and gender coordinator there. So thank you all of you, all three of you, for joining us today to speak about the topic that deals with policy, you know, the actual implementation once it's written, the formal written behavior. Like once that is written down as policy, what does that each mean to you? I think I'm going to start with Sonia, and then I'm going to bring in analysis about, you know, mobile phones and what it means to actually answer to the digital divide. And then also what it means for the economy to include women. And I'll bring in Tolulope at the end just to briefly comment on that. So thank you. Go ahead, Sonia.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you for inviting me to this panel. I look forward to an engaging conversation. So yes, the question of women's financial inclusion in our economies is really an important one, as you say, Mbalenhle. But I think, you know, to answer this question, we need to take a step back and think about how women engage with the economy and understanding what type of economy we have now that is in many ways perpetuating or reproducing high inequalities that are along gendered lines. Although we know it's not exclusively gendered, that inequality takes on various shapes and forms, particularly in a context like South Africa. And, you know, as an economist, as a feminist economist, we have been providing essential analysis to understand the economic dynamics that shape women's participation in our economies. And feminists have highlighted the many gendered, social, political, and economic costs of the pandemic, and have called for alternative proposals that recognize historical inequalities. So to start off, I think it's clear after the onset of the pandemic last year that, you know, women bore the brunt of the knock-on effects of COVID. There have been millions of women across the world who have been forced to quit their jobs, now known as the Great Resignation, in tandem with without adequate social protection to buffer against these effects. And in South Africa, we also know that more women lost their jobs than men, and yet women still do more than twice as much unpaid care labor than men, both in and outside the formal labor markets and households. So to even begin thinking about expanding women's financial inclusion in the economy, I think we need to grapple with the ways in which the economy should be supporting women and what the main reasons for why it isn't currently. And COVID has posed new questions for economic policymakers around the world. And I think in some ways provided a potential opportunity to rethink the way that macroeconomic policies are designed. And so to answer this question, I think we need to rethink, you know, it's a grappling of our economic systems. I was recently at COP26 earlier this month and was very much struck by how it seems easier to talk around systemic change than to directly address it, even though we know that the main causes of the climate crisis is because of an unsustainable economic system that rewards growth at the expense of sustainability. And that the climate crisis is very much a symptom of a much broader systemic problem in our society. So it's important for us to, I think, contend with how sustaining our current economic system in many ways depends on more than the activities that occur within the sphere of the so-called markets. This narrow conceptualization of the economy advanced within mainstream economics sees the economy as merely a site of production and market-based activities, which hides or obscures the extensive social relations that are also essential for the reproduction of the economy and the labor force more broadly. So, where do we start in terms of policy options to begin making economic policy more gender inclusive? I think there are three ways that I'll highlight now that governments and policymakers can intervene. Obviously, these are not exhaustive options, but I think are essential for us to begin unpacking what it means to include women in our economies. So first, I think we need to invest in the care economy. An ILO report has outlined how investment in the care economy needs to be doubled in the medium term to avert a looming global care crisis. And they propose that changes in policies should address the rising need for care and tackle the huge disparity between women's and men's care responsibilities. So investing in the care economy will help provide more decent employment opportunities while addressing the inadequate provision of care services. The South African experience shows that public employment programs have contributed to the progressive realization of decent work as a vital step in recognizing and remunerating care-related labor as work. Secondly, we need to increase social protection. Measures are urgently required to minimize loss of wages and earnings, particularly for the most vulnerable populations. A report by Olivier de Schutter, who's the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, argues that social protection should be seen as an investment with potentially high returns, since it leads to building human capital, it has significant multiplier effects in the local economy, and contributes to inclusive growth and to resilience in times of crisis like we are faced with now. So it's important that we implement gender responsive social protection systems to support income security. Oh, that was a mouthful. So reinstituting economic support packages, including the caregiver grants and expanded unemployment benefits, including informal workers. There should be direct cash transfers, which are a lifeline for those struggling to afford day-to-day necessities, especially during times of economic crisis. And in the medium term, another income support measure that needs to be taken seriously is the bridging of the gender wage gap. And this begins by enacting laws and policies that guarantee equal pay for work of equal value, so that we stop undervaluing the work that is done by women. And measures are needed to strengthen the government's capacity to deliver critical social services, particularly in healthcare and education, to rapidly reach and increase coverage of key vulnerable population groups. And lastly, we need to ensure our economic policies protect and not hinder human rights. Women's rights are human rights. We cannot talk seriously about strengthening women's financial inclusion without it being rooted in a strong human rights framework. In this way, human rights impact assessments are desperately required to assess the various economic measures put in place, including, for example, the proposed austerity measures implemented in a number of countries in response to the COVID crisis. And lastly, I just want to end off by saying that I recently heard Jita Sen talk about the COVID crisis and the current moment. And it was interesting. She said that, there's a whole lot going on about, building back better. But I think, instead of building back better, she says we need to build forward differently. We need to reimagine new economic systems that are care-centered and not profit-centered, that care about our economies, that care about the people in our economies, that care about the environment. And certainly there are many possible, another way is possible. I'll end off there.
Thank you for that. It is possible. It is possible to imagine new policies that think about care in ways that are so thorough and intentional And I thank you for that contribution. I also think that the digital economy has something it has to think through labor in new ways because of the pandemic as well. Labor and care are so intricately linked now that people are working digitally, now that people are learning on digital platforms, and now that there's an economy, an entire economy around, you know, what is online. And I think Chenai, I'm going to bring you in just to comment about the, you know, the digital economy and what that means for women's lives and what that means for gender as well, for gender equity.
Thank you so much, Bali. Good day to everyone from wherever you're dialing in from. It's such an honor to be on this panel and to be able to reflect on the digital economy. I think just putting it into context in terms of background, the reality is that with the pandemic, what we saw was everyone needed to be online. That's the place where we were communicating. That's the place where we were sharing jokes as a sense of relief. And that's where the place where people were providing information on generally how to cope with the pandemic. But the unfortunate reality is that it just amplified the fact that if you're specifically looking at the African region, we are really behind when it comes to being connected to the internet. According to the International Telecommunications Union statistics of 2020, 28% of people in urban areas are connected to the internet. 6% of people in rural areas are connected to the internet. Already we've got that existent divide before the pandemic even hit. And then when you specifically look at gender, what we have, because we've also got like a lack of information generally around this, from the sex, just aggregated data, you know, between male and female, because that's what's easily used, we find that like 20% of the population that identifies as female on the African continent has access to the internet, and 37% of the population that identifies as male has access to the internet. So what you find is an existent gender digital divide, which impacts the way in which people are actually able to participate in the digital economy. People are not online. And then when it comes to the people that are online, you're likely to find men being more online than women. So that sets the context in thinking about like the policy interventions and what needs to be done. So to actually strengthen women's participation in the digital economy, and when I think about women, I think about women and gender diverse people as well, because these are often the minority or the majority that are constantly marginalized when it comes to accessing the digital economy. To think that we need policies that actually ensure people's digital inclusion and address the existing social and cultural practices of exclusion that impact one's ability to fully be able to participate in the digital economy. So it's not just about people being connected, but it's also about addressing the societal factors that shape how people participate in the online space. So, and a first point in terms of an intervention in participating in the digital economy is around affordability. In 2014, I wrote a master's thesis on women's use of the mobile phones to actually for micro enterprises. And the thing that I was talking about as a barrier at that time was affordability to be able to use the internet fully. Well, in 2021, the affordability is still an issue. So it just goes to show that at the end of the day, if you can't access the service, you can't make use of the internet and you can't participate in the digital economy. And in addition to not just accessing like data, we still exist in contexts where tax is added to low-cost mobile devices that are usually quite the cheaper smartphones. And then this impacts the ability to actually buy a device that works in a way that will allow you to use the full internet. So then people get stuck on platforms such as WhatsApp or Facebook because those are zero rated or offer a lower credit to access, like a lower credit point in order for one to access this platform. So you stay there because it's cheaper. And then you're also thinking about generally issues such as social media tax, and this was instituted in social media and mobile money tax, which was instituted in Uganda, I think about 2 years ago, which actually has an impact on people being able to communicate. If you're taxing the platform where it's cheaper to communicate and engage in your business, what have you done in terms of building up your digital economy? And it often impacts women more because the result is the gender digital divide is because where we find the people with the least resources in terms of thinking about access to income and also access to education is usually women, in comparison to men who may also be in the same lower income bandwidth. So the realization is that intersectional issues that exist for women to be able to access the financial resources that allow for you to engage in these spaces. In addition to that, another policy intervention is around digital skills and digital literacy. As much as we may be able to address issues around affordability, lowering the prices, zero-rating educational sites, if people do not have the skills and literacy to be able to navigate the complete internet, right, and to be able to make use of it in a way that benefits them, what we've resulted in is we've opened the gates, but then now people are just stuck right at the beginning because they don't know how to navigate, and we're not investing in the ability for people to build up their digital skills and literacy. So that for me is a point of intervention that's really important when it comes to policy development. In the work that I did with the Web Foundation, when I was still leading that research, we found that for a lot of people in rural areas who didn't know how to, who weren't making use of the internet, it's because they didn't know how, and it was mainly women. So then you find that that's something that actually needs to shift. And then another point of intervention is, you know, like you set up the scene of people being able to access it and have the skills to use it. But there's a chilling effect that comes from the misogyny that we see online that actually then tends to impact women and gender diverse people's ability to participate. So then what we find in cases of, there's a need for specific policy interventions around online harassment and gender-based violence, online gender-based violence. The work that we saw last year in terms of like the South African government amending the domestic violence bill, there were a couple of feminists who got together with institutions such as Research ICT Africa, so it was Research ICT Africa, Feministing While African, and the Alt Advisory Network to actually have the domestic violence bill recognize intimate online gender-based violence as part of intimate partner violence. So the use of technology to impact that. So then there is just really, it's while the point is addressed in the cyber crimes bill, it's not enough to just have it in one space. It needs to speak to the different acts and different bills that we have that are existent. So it's important for them to think about it in a perspective of online safety allows for women to then participate in the digital economy and to put out the activities. We've seen a lot of people setting up Instagram businesses, but then the chilling effect is that if you then find people making use of the online platform to silence women because there's an idea of who's the kind, what are you able to say as a woman, to take down your business, because then people then have these like strategic moves of reporting accounts that they find problematic. What we then see, or just generally facing a sense of violence, someone threatening violence to you online or doxing you, like putting all your personal information on these platforms, what we then find is a chilling effect that we can create the internet, we can give people the skills, but they're afraid to go online because of the behavior of others, particularly because of the social and cultural practices we exist in, which determine the way a woman should behave online. So those are policy interventions that really need to be taken about. And then lastly, another policy intervention is with emerging technologies. We've seen the conversation around artificial intelligence. We've seen the policies and the discussions that are happening. Well, the discussions to set up policies that will then think about AI algorithms as a way of improving the economy of South Africa, specifically in this case. But what we don't realize are the harms that come from these kind of like new technologies, and these are not being dealt with as we are running to grow the economy without thinking about like what are the safety nets we need to put into place. We've seen discrimination as a result of algorithms, and the work that has been documented by Dr. Sophia Noble, in the work that's been done on data feminism, Catherine Ignacio and Lauren Klein, and the work that I did with my data rights focused on Africa. You find that there is bias that exists within these algorithms that then tend to be discriminatory towards particularly Black people, Black women in particular, and then also just generally limit the ability for one to access resources if the resources are being determined based on an algorithm. We've seen this instance in terms of people who are trying to access social service funds, social grants and how their data was then sold off to a third-party company, and the mess that happened around that, and then, you know, the ability for people to be able to say no if they're already in a disempowered position. So what does that mean for people to be able to participate in a digital economy that's set up against them right from the beginning, as new emerging technologies are put in place in order to better the digital economy? So we exist in sort of like a paradox. So those are the harms that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about, you know, moving forward into the fourth industrial revolution, moving forward into the digital economy, because at the end of the day, we're creating a space where women can't actively participate in. I haven't been watching the time, so I'll round this off by just saying that, like, policy is part of the solution, and thinking about the digital economy, there really is work that needs to be done to look at the issues and interventions of women's participation in the digital economy from a perspective of social and cultural practices that we have, from a perspective of the actual skill set that even the policymakers that themselves have to understand the issues, and to also look at it from a perspective of holding the people who design the technologies, who build the platforms, accountable, because oftentimes we find that people will put forward a solution of, we're making life easier, say for example for domestic workers by moving their access to employers onto the online platforms, but what results is that we are losing social safety nets around like worker rights, because we've moved into the digital platform and no one is doing that critical work of assessing what the digital economy now means. Thanks, Pali.
Thank you for that contribution. I think you highlighted a lot about the digital economy, about how it excludes and how it is not engineered with the Black woman in mind, that it's engineered to exclude them and to also not give them the infrastructure they need to learn about the digital life, or the digital literacy. I like the word literacy, and how you emphasize that people don't take on the tools that they need to take on because they don't know how to, they don't have the literacy. And so that was really important to highlight. There's a question that I have one for Sonia, and then I have one for Chenai. So for Chenai, I'm going to start with you. So there's a question that asks, how do you balance the cost of services versus the zero-rated access to digital literacy or platform sites as it affects women?
So how do you balance the costs? Is this in terms of thinking about the cost to the operators, in terms of thinking about the cost to the companies, to the state? What I've seen in terms of thinking about zero rating, most of the times it's been taken on as a corporate social responsibility practice. So thinking about it in a way as like it's either incentivized through tax, non-taxable activities. So you find that a lot of mobile network operators will be zero rating educational platforms as part in agreement with governments and as part of their corporate social responsibility. There is also what we call the Universal Service Access Funds, although there's a lot of like controversy in terms of like, has it been beneficial to have this or has it not, where oftentimes this fund base is actually used to then support initiatives that allow for access to digital literacy activities, and then also have them earmarked as specifically like, you know, offsetting the costs to the providers by actually using this public fund that operators contribute to. So the issue often around like universal service access funds is how they're used and who implements them. So most of the times they're then not implemented to target the groups that are often marginalized. They either then go back into infrastructure spend. So a lot of the issues is it's not necessarily like how do you offset the cost, but with the resources that are there, how do you make sure that they're going to be spent to address the digital divide issues, particularly from a gender perspective, and so that we don't end up having the space of issues where, you know, like community centers, which were useful at one time, are like, you know, the go-to solution, but there's also a challenge of people actually being able to access these community centers because maybe they're far away, and maybe one can't walk there at night, or maybe there are gatekeepers who say, you know, you can only enter this space and you can only enter this space to like write a CV, but we don't want you to like use Facebook because we think Facebook is a redundant activity, yet your whole lifeline exists on Facebook. So those are the things to think about, like offsetting the cost and looking at how best do we use the current resources that are there.
Okay, thank you for that response. So the cost is nuanced from what I hear. It's very nuanced. I'm also going to ask Sonia. So, and there's a question that says, investing in the care economy via policy is great. However, how do we ensure that it reaches households and communities that are already underserved in terms of services? So how will policy become beneficial for, you know, overburdened women on the ground, and also those that are excluded in terms of their basic services?
Yes, and thank you for that question. It's a very important question. You know, this question of how do we ensure that essentially the state is capacitated enough to reach areas of the economy that are currently very marginalized. And I think this is a much bigger, broader conversation about what is the role of the state and what is the role of the private sector. What we're seeing currently is an increasing creep, so an increasing privatization of core basic services, such as healthcare, increasing privatization of infrastructure provision, and all of these infrastructures are essential to unburden the disproportionate burden that women effectively perform. So I think we need to think about definitely capacitating the state to provide some of these core state provisions, such as in healthcare, such as in water and electricity. These are things that the state should be providing at low costs. And these are essentially the things that reduce women's burden, care burden. And I think we also need to think about radically reducing the amount of care work that women do, which I think Chenai spoke about. Chenai spoke about kind of gender norms. We need to think differently about what is perceived as a woman's role and what is perceived as a man's role, and how these perceptions in many ways contribute to, you know, gender bias and GBV in South Africa in very many different ways. So yeah, so this is a very important conversation about, you know, whose voice is heard and whose voice should be heard. I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think that's also, it's linked to, you know, accessing the rural woman who is the hardest to access in terms of financial inclusion. So I think even when speaking about agriculture, when speaking about actual land and women's rights and land rights, what do you say and what do you have to contribute in terms of women's financial inclusion? I think there's a lot happening there. There's a lot of trends. And so I'm going to bring in Tolulope Babajide just to comment on that.
Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon from Nigeria. Can you hear me? Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for mentioning rural women, because most of the times when we speak, when we talk about women, we often forget that demographic. And I'm going to be using a lot of Nigerian context when talking about rural women today. In Nigeria, we have more than 50% of our population that are women, and we also have more than 50% of that particular number, of that particular percentage, of are women that live in rural areas, and a lot of there's been a lot of barriers to these women, and also looking at women in agriculture. In Nigeria, 70% of the entire smallholder farmers in Nigeria are women that are either majorly in subsistence farming. And when we look at the barriers, we have barriers, access to land, access to information, access to technology, access to credit. Well, looking at even looking at the financial inclusion landscape in Nigeria, we still have 38% that are not financially included. And a majority of this number are also rural women. And often when we also look at land rights, so typically we have various kind of laws in Nigeria. We have the customary law, we have the federal law, but even though the federal law mandates that women can own lands, by the time you come to customary law, where a lot in the rural areas, which is quite more obtainable in the rural areas where we have these women, the customary law is still very rigid when it comes to issues of access to land. So we have women that are breaking their backs on the farm. We have women that are involved in, all year round farming, but still do not have access to land, still do not have, most of the times they will have to lease the land. Most of the time they will have to rent the land, which then cut into their profit. So, and I know that there's been various policies, but the policies are we've still not been able to operationalize the policies to really to favor the women in the rural areas. And also, talking about financial inclusion, also, I will take a lead from what Chenai mentioned earlier. When we talk about literacy, when we talk about even infrastructure. So when we talk about digital economy, it's easier for everyone on this call to talk about digital economy who could relate to it. But when it comes to these rural women, they can't relate to it because even most of them do not even have phones at all to start with. Even if they have phones, we are going to be talking about feature phones that would not allow them to even participate in this kind of digital economy, which then makes financial inclusion quite difficult, because when we look at the infrastructure, most of the areas in most of the rural areas in Nigeria, we do not have, we have epileptic mobile telephony, we have situations, and also the security challenges has also exacerbated what is going on, which has also denied women or rural women of their rights to be included in the financial services. So we have a case of a situation where a woman has a feature phone. With that feature phone, what do we expect her to be able to do with her? The only thing that woman can do is to do a USSD payment, and that is the least that person can. Also literacy, what is most of the rural women do not even see themselves as, they do not see themselves as, they do not think that the financial service providers understand what their needs are, and that is what I'm trying to say. Most of the time, the products that are being packaged for the rural women are products that cannot meet their needs at all. And it's also an error when we think about financial services, when we think about financial needs, and we think that the rural women do not have diverse financial needs. I would say it's a lie. They have diverse financial needs. What has happened for such a long time is that we've not been able to really sit down and understand what their financial needs are and to be able to design in response to these financial needs. But there's been a lot of shift in Nigeria when it comes to understanding the financial needs of people that live in rural areas. It's totally different from the needs, the needs of people that live in urban and peri-urban areas. For a woman that is living in a far remote area that is into agriculture, she will probably be thinking about, oh, how can I access the cash transfer? How can I, pay for fertilizer? How can I, pay for, how can I access microcredit? So the first point for us is to be able to even sit down and understand what their needs are, and then look at what kind of services can we put together to be able to meet these needs. And I will talk about the various policies from the Nigerian side right now. Presently, we have we've had payment service banks, and these are FSPs that are able to reach the last mile because of the widespread of their network, and also because of when we look at even opening of bank accounts. By the time we look at bank accounts, for a long time, rural women have not been able to even open bank accounts because of the KYC that is attached to it. And the KYC, they will be asking of utility bills. That means that they will, for a long time, women have been asked, oh, can you bring your water bill? Can you bring your electricity bill? But because rural women do not even have access to this sort of, they do not have access to this sort of KYC, they've been for a long time denied. But now we have situations whereby we have this tier 1 accounts where all you need to open an account is to be able to have a phone number. But even in that, we are also seeing some certain realities, because even when a woman gives you a phone number, by the time you go to the back end to regularize the bank account, you would see that the phone number does not even belong to her. So I would say that there are so many barriers that we have to, push through to be able to serve, to be able to answer to the needs of the rural women. Is diverse. It's something that we all need to really understand that demographic very well to be able to answer to their needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think you really explained the rural woman and the rural woman's needs and the need for policy to really speak to that. And I think that's really important when talking about the digital divide, when talking about the care economy as well. I think you all had, you put in your own thread to the conversation, and this conversation was really, really rich. So thank you so much for coming to the panel today. And from your respective areas and locations and geographies, I want to say thank you and goodbye.